Okay, so we're 1/5 done. Well, sort of. We finished the first of the 5 books of Torah. We finished Genesis. And so now we're going to move into Exodus. And if just a reminder, so today's lesson is the first part of Exodus, the part you studied for today. This is the last week of this section, so the rest is going to continue after Christmas. So after Christmas, there's going to be 2 more, I think, on Exodus, and then 1 each on Leviticus, 1 on Numbers, and 1 on Deuteronomy. So that'll be after Christmas. So before we talk specifics about Exodus, we should talk a little bit about Exodus. So first of all, the title, Exodus, comes from the Septuagint. Remember that LXX is the number 70? That's the Septuagint. From the theme of the book, going forth from Egypt. So Exodus means a going forth. So that's where we get our title for the book from. The Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and spiritually speaking, don't call it Exodus. They call it Shemet. Okay, and they call it that because it comes from the first word. So remember, all the books of Torah in the Septuagint are thematically named. In Hebrew, they're all named after the first words of the book. Okay, so we've got, so Exodus in Greek, referring to the journey, and then the Shemata from Hebrew, from the Masoretic text, which means the names, because it starts with, these are the names of the descendants of Jacob, right? So that's where it gets its title from. One author described the book of Exodus as an indelible portrait of the community of God, called from false and demeaning servitude in an alien land to journey to the promised land. So that pretty much sums up Exodus. So I'm done. Any questions? No. Just kidding. The structure of Exodus is such that it seems to be coming from different sources, but it was edited by that P tradition. Remember we talked about Yahwist, Elohist, priestly, Deuteronomic. It was the priestly tradition coming back from exile in the 6th century BC that seemed to put this book together into its current form, which it talks about rescuing from slavery and journeying to the promised land. The journey is marked in 12 stages, and so you can kind of see how the author redacted this, edited this, so each section begins with, they departed from someplace and camped out at someplace else. And so you can see almost this continuing thing as they journey. You can see how they're divided out these different stages. Somebody gave this as a general outline, I think is as good as any. And I know it's kind of hard to read, but to fit all on one slide was tricky. So you have the Hebrews find themselves in danger. God calls and commissions Moses. We have the 10 plagues and the Passover event, which is the 10th plague, of course. The destruction of the Egyptians and the Song of Miriam at the Red Sea. Journeying to Sinai and Canaan. The covenant. The building of the the design of the dwelling. Apostasy. Apostasy is that fancy word. It means denying your faith. Apostasy and covenant renewal, and then the actual building of the dwelling. When we talk about the dwelling, we're talking about the Ark of the Covenant and the tent and a meeting tent and all that stuff. Okay, so that's just one way of outlining the general flow of the book. One of the most interesting questions is timing. When was all this written? So you look for clues in the text itself. So Exodus 1:8 says, a new king who didn't know Joseph. So king here refers to Pharaoh in Egypt. So it had to be a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. So if you're looking at a time frame when the Pharaoh that knew Joseph is still alive, that can't be when this is happening because this Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph. Possibly with a new dynasty in 1550 and resulting long period of enslavement. The text implies a short period of slavery before the Exodus. So if you look at the timing of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and you look at a short time of slavery, some people will narrow it down to 1450 to 1350 BC. There is some evidence of Hebrews already being in Palestine, and 1 Kings, first book of Kings, which comes like at the time of David and Solomon and so on, says the temple was built around 950, 480 years after leaving Egypt. So if you add 950 and 480, you're getting someplace in this range. Okay? So that's one of the ways that people date this. Another way they date it as much more recently is 1300 to 1250. The text says there were storehouses built by Hebrew slaves. We know that there were storehouses built at cities of Ramses and Pithom, likely around 1300. And then there's a skirmish with the Israelites in 1225 when the Israelites were not yet settled in the Promised Land. So if they're not yet settled in the Promised Land, that means that Exodus could still be happening. So it could be as late as 1250, 1300. Some people dated in there. It's hard to find historical evidence exactly of a king named Ramses II. But with the evidence that they do have, it looks like if this was during the reign of Ramses II, it was most likely then around 1300, 1280 that this took place. And then remember, of course, they're 40 years in the desert, so it's 40 years after that point. Notice the numbers are going backwards again. Remember, this is BC, so it's 1300 to 1280, not 1280 to 1300, because that's the way we count in AD, but it's not the way we count in BC. So just to give you an idea, so remember we said Abraham was around 1800. So this is probably around 500 years later, okay? So you have some generations between Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and we'll get into a couple other names in just a minute. So again, it's a guess, but it seems to be a logical guess. The last thing I wanted to show you here before we get into the text itself is this is the probable route of the Exodus. And so I made copies of all that for all of you, because I know you're not going to be able to see all of that real well. 4, 5, 6. You want an extra one for Ray?
No. Adjust the screen.
Nah, there's no way to adjust that to big enough.
That's it.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good thought, but it's not big enough. So I gave you a copy there, but so you see landmarks here. Goshen. So remember in the text that the Hebrews are living in the land of Goshen. So this is the city of Ramses and Pithom right here. So this is in Goshen. So most likely they're embarking from here, heading down across the Red Sea right here. This is where they think that city is, where they crossed the Red Sea in Exodus 14. That's where they think that took place. So then they went from there down along to Mount Sinai, down here in the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, up here to this city, and then they get confused. They head this way and come back here, and then they go back this way, and eventually they come back around this way through what we would call Jordan into Canaan. Okay, so that's kind of the presumed route of Exodus. Okay, so now that we covered some background, let's get into the actual text. I call this chapter Establishing a People. We've got a free seat right up in here. So you have the beginning where we talk about the call of Moses. When I first saw this, I thought Moses was complaining because he got a hot foot, but it's not. He's taking off his sandals because God is telling him to take off his sandals. So we start off with where we left off in Genesis. We have the descendants of Jacob. Jacob's other name is, so these people are called the Israelites, also sometimes called the Hebrews. So the text uses both terms. The descendants of Jacob. So we have telling us about the 12 sons and the favorable Pharaoh. We know those are all gone. And Jacob's descendants are proliferating. So there's a whole lot of descendants now. Pharaoh feels threatened and tries to control this proliferation. He enslaves the descendants of Jacob against God's will. Is it God's will they be enslaved? No. And why does he say it? The text actually says, lest they escape the land. So that's why he enslaves them, lest they escape the land, which is exactly what happens anyways, because he enslaves them, right? Because they're enslaved, they call out for freedom, and God frees them. So it's the very act of enslaving them that causes their freedom and leaving the land. The midwives are to the Hebrew women. Notice it says midwives to the Hebrew women, so they're probably not Hebrews themselves. They're the midwives to the Hebrew women. Are ordered to kill all the male children. Now, I want to stop here for just a second. Orders them to kill all the male children. Where have we heard in the Bible, someplace else, where all the male children were so said to be killed? Jesus, Gospel of Matthew, very beginning of Gospel of Matthew, Herod orders all the boys to be killed, right? Pay attention as we read through these first couple chapters of Exodus about the parallels regarding the birth of Jesus and the birth of Moses, okay? The Matthean author, the author of the Gospel according to Matthew, is very much utilizing the same pattern of what happened to explain what happened to Jesus, because he wants to show Jesus as the new Moses. So we talked about that in Passion and Resurrection narratives, but just pay attention to some of the similarities that you're going to see here between the beginning of Moses' life and the beginning of Jesus' earthly life. Moses is hid in the Nile, just like Pharaoh had ordered. His parents are Amram and Jochebed, born of Levi. So interesting, born of Levi. Oh, one last thing I want to say about the midwives. The midwives' names are remembered, Shiphrah and Puah. Did you notice that in the text? Who's the main character right now in Exodus that's not been named? Pharaoh. We remember the names of the midwives, but we don't remember the name of Pharaoh because maybe the midwives were heroes and they didn't listen to Pharaoh's murderous order, and Pharaoh was not a hero, so he's not worth remembering. The midwives used their wits to outwit Pharaoh. So we get into chapter 2. That's Moses' sister Miriam placing the basket into the Nile River. So he's born of Levi. That's important because what comes to us from Levi? The Levitic priesthood, okay? So Moses is in the line of Levi. So he's in the line of the people who will be the priests in the religion. His parents are Amram and Jochebed. Miriam is placed to see what happens to her brother. What happens to her brother? Pharaoh decides to raise the child as her own, and she names him Moses. Moses is derived from a Hebrew word, Moshe, which is related to the Hebrew word Masa. Remember, no vowels. Moshe, Masa, okay, which means to draw out. Okay? So she drew him out of the water. And that's what the text tells us. So she named him because she drew him out in a Hebrew language word. She's Egyptian, right? But also the meaning of the word Moses in Hebrew resembles the word for to be born of. So there's two meanings for his name at play here. There's the Hebrew meaning, he was drawn out of the river, and the Egyptian meaning born of, because born of the river and born to her. So so it's interesting that Moses has both of those meanings. Moses knows he's Hebrew. One very important thing to say. When you're studying Exodus, don't watch the movie. Everybody knows which movie I'm talking about, right? Charlton Heston, 10 Commandments. Don't watch the movie. Because the movie is not always faithful to the text. For example, there's no Nefertiti anywhere in the text. Remember that was Charlton Heston's love interest in 10 Commandments? She doesn't exist in the text. Moses grows up, he doesn't find out he's an Egyptian or he's Hebrew until he's well into his adulthood. That's not the text. That's Cecil B. DeMille making a great movie. Yes.
Baby boys circumcised by 8 days, and so what? They have no.
There's no rule for law for circumcision at this point. There is a sense that, so you got to remember, most likely, the text that we're reading was not all written at one time. Parts were written, somebody put other stuff in later, somebody put other stuff in later. It seems to be that most of the circumcision stuff is added later by the editor that I just talked about in the 6th century. So even the circumcisions that happened in Genesis were probably added later to the text. Because if the only way you can belong to the chosen people is by circumcision, Moses has to be circumcised. Abraham has to be circumcised. Isaac and Jacob had to be circumcised. Okay? There doesn't seem to be any evidence that that was part of the ritual until after they came back from exile. So it might be that the post-exilic writers are adding that to the text.
Previously, I can't remember. That one of the things God said or he was one of.
Yes. Remember we said that the sons of the Canaanites wanted to marry, but they had to be circumcised first. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, we've read that in Genesis. No, it's not happening already because that's added later to the text. This is where the authorship can be a little confusing. It seems to be that was added later back to Genesis to show that these important peoples in our faith tradition belong to the covenant. Okay? It's kind of like if you would say, okay, we have a story of George Washington, but we didn't find out until last year when we were doing some digging and some other records that George Washington had a daughter named Sally Sue. Okay? So now you have a question, okay? And Sally Sue seems to have been born when George Washington was 30. Well, the biography we have doesn't say anything about Sally Sue. So somebody writes in Sally Sue, who was born when he was 30-something years old, because it fits the biography, it fits the narrative. But we didn't know about it back then. So maybe the 6th century author knows something about the rituals, the laws, the covenants, the way they have to be filled out, and puts it back in to show that these people are part of the covenant too. Okay? Because you got to remember, this is almost certainly not written by one author, all 5 of these books. It does make it confusing. We have different authors. But those kinds of details are not what's really most important to our faith. They're interesting to know. They're good history and that sort of thing. But they're not necessarily essential for our practice of our Judeo-Christian faith. What is important is that these people belong to God. How do they belong to God? By accepting him as their God and following his laws. That's the important part. So yeah, but it gets confusing. This is why I started off by talking about the authorship, because sometimes these kinds of questions pop up and it seems to be explainable because of the authorship. We're going to see the same thing in just a few minutes when we see the name of Moses' father-in-law. He has 2 different names in the text. Why does he have 2 different names? Is it because one group of people knew him as one name, another group of people knew him as another name? Why were there 2 creation accounts in the very first chapters of Genesis? One was probably written by one author at one time, one was probably written by another author another time, answering 2 different questions. How is it that we're here, or why are we here? And what is our relationship with God? So those are things that when you study the authorship, those become questions and say, okay, why does this make sense? Well, it makes sense because it probably wasn't written all at the same time. So good question. So Moses knows he's Hebrew despite being raised by Pharaoh. He murders with full intent. Notice the text said, he looked this way and that way to make sure nobody was looking, and then he killed. It wasn't like he was self-defending. It wasn't like it was just like a spontaneous thing that happened. No, he thought about it for a second first. So Moses committed murder. Notice the text, who made you prince and judge over us? Well, we're going to see in the book of Exodus exactly who it is that makes Moses prince and judge. He flees off to Midian. Remember the name Midian? Abraham's second wife, one of her sons, was Midian. So the Midianites are the descendants of Midian. Remember we talked about corporate person, Israelites, Edomites. Now we're talking about the Midianites. Those are descendants of Abraham's second wife. We're introduced to Moses' father-in-law. He's the priest of Midian. His name is Reuel. What do we hear in there at the end of the word? El, which means God, right? So Reuel means friend of God. Later on, he's going to be called Jethro. So he's got two different names. Yeah, not Jethro to Bodine. Jethro. He meets his wife, Zipporah. Where does he meet her? The same place where Isaac met his wife, the same place where Jacob meets his wife, at the well, right? And he marries Zipporah. They have a son named Gershom. Ger comes from the Hebrew word that means sojourner or traveler. And Shum comes from there, so he's a traveler there. Because Moses knows he's a traveler among the Midianites. So he names his son a traveler there. The daughters of Reuel tell him that an Egyptian delivered us. Interesting language, right? An Egyptian delivered us. And it's going to be an Egyptian, Moses, who delivers not just the Midianites, but delivers the Israelites. That Pharaoh dies, the one who Moses was part of his household. The Israelites cry for help. So this is the first time in Exodus that we see any kind of reaching out to God. Okay? The Israelites cried for help. God hears and chooses to act, remembering the covenant he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay? So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3. I love this picture because, again, that movie doesn't portray it, I don't think, well, because the text tells us Moses was 80 when this happened. Moses was not 25, 30 years old like Charlton Heston was. So Moses was 80 when he encounters the burning bush. Here's one of those things again. He's at Mount Horeb, which is synonymous with Sinai. So when you hear Mount Horeb, you can hear Mount Sinai, but it's likely a different peak in the same range. Okay, but down at the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula on your map. The angel of the Lord speaks. But notice the angel of the Lord speaks in the first person as God. I am going to do this. I am this. Remember how I said angel and God sometimes are interchangeable? So it's the angel of the Lord speaking in the first person as if he's God. So here there's no distinction. If you're hearing God speaking to you, you're hearing the angel speak to you, you're hearing God speak to you. It's the same thing. Okay? A burning bush, but not consumed. Moses is paying attention, which moves God to act. Okay? So God acts because Moses is paying attention, he's listening. God tells him this is holy ground. Why is it holy ground? Because God is there. So he tells him, take off your sandals, it's holy ground. He identifies himself as the God of his ancestors. So he picks out the important ancestors of Moses and identifies himself. That was a very common way for people to talk about God in that time and in that culture. Gods would always introduce themselves as the God of famous ancestors. So this is a very common mode for identifying himself. Moses is afraid to die if he looks at God. Everybody thought that if you look directly at the face of God, you would die. So Moses has that instinct too. If you look directly at the face of God, you're going to die. So he doesn't. He hides his face. From the very beginning, though, God is acting out of compassion. God is feeling the suffering of his people, and God acts first. He promises to give the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, and all those other groups to his people. What's that a fulfillment of? The promise of land, right? So the descendants are plenty. In fact, so plentiful that Pharaoh's worried. But now they have to be given their land. So God says to Moses, I will send you and I will be with you. Remember, by the way, God is with the Egyptians or the Israelites in Egypt. He's not back in Canaan. Okay? We don't really see that anymore with God. God is going to become constantly with his people now. The Exodus event and its success and your worship of me, God says, will be the sign that I'm with you. So because I'm going to deliver you, That's a sign that I'm with you. And when you worship me, that's going to be the other sign that I'm with you. So God promised to be, and then eventually he reveals his name. I am who am. There's a whole lot. I could do 25 minutes on just that name, those 4 words. But what I'm going to try and narrow this to is, first of all, God is revealing his name. Remember when Jacob wrestled with the man, the angel? He didn't reveal his name. God is now revealing his name. But he's not just revealing his name, he's revealing his very nature. Without getting too complicated and going into too much theology, God is. That's another way of saying I am who am. I'm not who was. I'm not who will be. I am who am. God is always in the present tense. God exists outside of time. So there can't be any past with God. There can't be any future with God. God is. And that's another way of saying I am who am. So it tells us not only his name, but it also tells us about his nature. His desire to not be described. Another thing we say in theology, Thomas Aquinas wrote beautifully about this. We can't say anything positive that's adequate to describing God. Even if we say God is omnipotent, that's not adequate to describe God's knowledge. Even if we say, or God's power, even if we say God is omniscient, that's not adequate to describe God's knowledge. Even if we say he's omnipresent, that's not enough to say. So by giving this name, I am who am, he's also saying, and you can't define me. Because if you try and define me, if you try to put qualities to me and characteristics to me, then that gives you power over who I am. Because you're defining who I am now. Without going into a whole homily, this is a big trap for people of faith. Oh, God is my friend. Okay, but if that's all he is, you don't understand who God is. God is my teacher. Well, if that's all God is to you, then you don't understand who God is. Anything we could say like that, we're trying to put a quality on God. We're trying to pigeonhole him. We're trying to confine him and saying, okay, God, this is where you get to be in my life because I put this quality on you. But God is bigger than any quality we can put on him.
Those are human terms.
Oh, sure, exactly. But that's all we have. Yeah. So God is purposely giving his name, I am who am, so that we can't put those things on him. So we can't define who he gets to be in our life. He gets to define who he is. And then we have to either accept that or not accept it. By the way, the Hebrew version of this, YHWH. God then identifies himself. He continues. He says, first of all, I am who am. Then he says, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that you know who I am in relationship with people you already know. I'm the God of your ancestors. He also says he's Adonai. Remember, Adonai is Lord. It's translated in our Bibles as Lord. And the God of the Hebrews, as opposed to the God of the Egyptians or the God of the Canaanites or whatever. So, but any of those, see, God of the Hebrews, if he just says that, I'm the God of the Hebrews, who is he not the God of then? The Canaanites, the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks. If he says, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, well, I'm not the God of Ishmael then. I'm not the God of Esau. So again, he's limited. You see that? So any other name we can put to him besides that limits God. It tries to confine him. And God says, I'm not going to be confined. That's my name. And God's power, his absolute power, will bring about the Exodus and will despoil the Egyptians. Chapters 4 through 6. I lumped these 3 chapters together because it's a lot of repetition from what we've already heard. God promises help to Moses. Moses says, they're not going to believe me. God says this thing with the staff, throwing it down, turns to the snake. The leprous hand, he puts it in his coat, it comes out leprous, puts it back in, it's all healed. So God is trying to show him I'm all powerful, I have power over nature. Moses then complains, I'm not eloquent. God says, I'm going to provide for you. Moses finally says, excuse me, send somebody else. So don't pick me, I'm not good enough. Don't pick me, I'm not good enough. You know what? Just send somebody else. And the text says that God got angry at that point. He tells them, go back to your people. Go back to your people in Egypt. Those seeking your life are dead. Those seeking your life are dead. The angel says to Moses, those who are seeking your life are dead. Remind you of anything else in another passage in the Bible? Joseph, exactly. The foster father of Jesus. The angel says to him, while he's in Egypt, go back. Those who were seeking the child's life are dead. Okay? So you see how Matthew is using that. Chapter 5. Oh, sorry, we're still in chapter 5. Moses goes to Pharaoh, let my people go. Pharaoh's answer is, no, let them go cut straw. Let them work harder. The people who cry out now, this is a very important thing too. This is a pattern you're going to see through the rest of Torah. These people who initially cried out to God for deliverance, when God starts his plan for deliverance, complain because it's not what they want him to do. It's going to happen over and over and over again. They cry out to God for deliverance. God doesn't affect the freedom the way they want it to be affected, and so they doubt. And in this case, Moses also doubts. This is a pattern you're going to see over and over again. Probably could safely say that's a pattern that's still alive and well today. God, help me with this. God doesn't help us the way we expect him to help it, so phooey on God. This is what's going on in chapter 5. Chapter 6 is a promise of deliverance. God recounts he was revealed as El Shaddai. Remember that title too, El Shaddai? The all-powerful. Okay? He doesn't call himself Yahweh here. He calls himself El Shaddai. He says, I promised you land, I heard your groaning, and I'm going to take care of fulfilling my promise to you. So again, he's repeating what we've already heard. I will be your God, and you will be my people. That's the covenant. And then there's this little section of genealogy in there, just to help us get frustrated with pronouncing all these names again. So remember, there's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. One of them is Levi, the fourth one. No, third one. He has a son named Kohath. Kohath has a son named Amram. And Amram has a son named Moses. Okay, so now you're really talking about 4 generations from Jacob. So when you're trying to date this, is Moses 125 years younger than Levi? Or do we go by these dates of Levi was 150 years old when he died, and Moses is 80 when he's called? And so again, it's all part of that trying to figure out the timing of all this. But the point of the author is to show us that he's in the line of the priests, the Levitical priesthood. Okay? Chapters 7 through 9. This is Moses and Aaron turning the Red Sea red, or turning the Nile River red, excuse me. And that's the first plague. This is the 10th plague. This is the son of Pharaoh dying because he's the firstborn son. And he's telling Moses and Aaron, get out. So God commands Aaron, so about these plagues. So God commands Aaron to cast his rod down. Aaron does so, but so do Pharaoh's servants. But Aaron's rod swallows the other one. Interesting. So God tells Aaron to work a sign that the Egyptians can work as well. Could God have picked a different sign that the Egyptians couldn't do, like, make the dead rise and come back from the dead? He picks a sign that he knows, because God knows everything, that the Egyptians can do as well. But he also allows Moses or Aaron's staff to swallow up the other staffs.
He lets them do.
I'm sorry?
He lets the Egyptians do.
Yeah. So is it trying to elicit faith? Because if faith is easy, is it true? Faith is strongest when it's been tested. And so God allows them to work a sign that cannot be duplicated by the enemy. Will you trust? Will you trust even when it seems like the signs Aaron's doing, these guys can do as well? So he doesn't come out with both barrels, God. He could have gone right to the 10th plague, right? He's trying to build faith by starting with something that the Egyptians can do as well. And you're going to see there's a couple other things the Egyptians can do as well, or can be explained away by nature. We have 3 sets of plagues. 2nd through 4th, 5th through 7th, 8th through 9th. It's interesting because the text introduces them the same way. In the first of each set, Moses warns Pharaoh in the morning. In the second of each set, God says, go and tell Pharaoh. And in the third of each set, there is no warning. So with number 2 and number 5, you have this idea of Moses going out in the morning to warn Pharaoh. In the second one, so numbers 3 and 6, God says, go and tell Pharaoh. And in the third of each set, 4 and 7, there is no warning. It's just the plague is inflicted. So you've got a literary style being set up there. God is showing his power, but allowing for doubts. There's people who have written whole essays saying, well, the flies came because there was a pestilence, and the pestilence came because there was bloating, and the bloating came because of this, and the water turned red because it was dust coming down from the mountains that make the waters look red. There's all these kinds of natural explanations for all this. So you can look at that a couple ways. You can say, well, it's all made up then. God didn't have anything to do with it. Well, you could say that. Or you can say that maybe God affected all these natural things to cause these things to happen. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Or it could be that all these things were supernatural. They have no natural explanation for them, but it left enough room for doubt. It leaves enough room for doubt that maybe God didn't do this. So am I going to believe that God did this, or am I not going to believe that God did this? Because remember, that's how faith works. Faith gets tested. Are you going to choose to believe, or are you going to choose not to believe? So all of these plagues that God inflicts are not in themselves, 1 through 9, none of those convinces everybody that this is God at work. Not one of them. Okay? So God is showing his power, but he's also allowing room for doubt to see if people will choose to believe. He's also showing, this is an interesting thing too, he has power over the gods of Egypt. He even says in the text, I will inflict this on the gods of Egypt. Each of the 10 plagues could be drawn a line connecting to one of the Egyptian gods. So there's like an Egyptian god that controls frogs. There's an Egyptian god that controls darkness. There's an Egyptian god that controls water. So some people have mapped that out and showing that God is one by one, showing he's more powerful than the Egyptian gods. Now remember, the audience, this is happening to, the people this is happening to, and the original audience believes that there are other gods. Okay? At this point, they believe there are other gods. There's the Canaanite gods, there's the Baals, there's the Egyptian gods, there's all these other gods. So they believe there's other gods. But God is showing his power over each of these so-called gods. For example, the waters of the Nile turn red. Again, you could say it's this dust that came down out of the mountains that caused it to look red. That explains the water in the Nile. It doesn't explain the water in the people's pools and in their vessels. So the vessels of water they'd already drawn. That doesn't explain how they're red, but they're red too. Okay? No, not going there yet. Okay. So plagues 2 through 4. Plague number 2, the frogs afflict the land and the people. Pharaoh asks for a reprieve from Moses. It's granted, but his heart remains hardened. Then there's gnats caused by Aaron and Moses to appear. But Pharaoh's magicians this time cannot duplicate that. They could duplicate the water, they could duplicate the staff, but they can't duplicate the gnats. Flies are sent by God. But the Israelites are protected in Goshen, the land of Goshen. So it says it's all over Egypt, but not in Goshen. Pharaoh says you can go ahead and sacrifice, because what Moses has been asking for all along, to let us sacrifice and worship God. But Pharaoh says you can worship God, but you have to do it here. You can't leave. Remember what Pharaoh was afraid of? That the slaves would all walk off. So his way of making sure they don't walk off is you can sacrifice, but you have to sacrifice here.
Does 10 have any significance in the Hebrew?
Yes. I'm drawing a blank right now, but there is. I will get that answer for you. There is. And the only thing I'm thinking of right now is the answer to 12, but that's not the same answer. So yeah, I'll get back to you on that. You could sacrifice, but you have to sacrifice here. Then Moses bargains with him, and Pharaoh says, okay, you can go away, but you have to be close by. So we can gather you back up and bring you back into slavery. So Pharaoh's not convinced. 1, 2, 3, and 4 are not convincing Pharaoh yet. Plagues 5 through 7 in chapter 9. Death to the livestock, but the Israelite cattle is spared. Plague number 6, boils on man and beast, but the Israelites are spared. Plague number 7, thunder and hail is called down. No hail in Goshen. And the text said hail bigger than they'd ever seen in Egypt, but none in Goshen. Pharaoh confesses his sin and admits to Moses that he sinned and he should have listened to God. But it's very clear that Pharaoh doesn't mean it. What Pharaoh's trying to do is be relieved from the plague. Parallel in our times. A person who's sorry for their sins because they got caught or because God's going to punish, not because they've really hurt God, not because they've really been disobedient to the Lord. That's what Pharaoh's doing. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Make this go away. Not I'm sorry, I'm going to change. There's no metanoia, there's no conversion going on here. Chapter 10, plagues 8 and 9. Plagues number 8 is the locusts. Moses says, let us go worship. Okay, you can go, but only the men can go. Because if you leave your wives here, you'll come back. Another false admission of sin. Plague number 9, the darkness. Now Pharaoh says, okay, all the people can go, but you can't take your flocks and herds. Now that's important because the flocks and the herds, if you say, okay, we need to offer a sacrifice to God, well, good, you can take this one cow, or you can take this one sheep, or you can take one of each. Moses says, no. We have to take all of the sheep and the cattle with us because we don't know which one of these God's going to want until we get there. So we have to bring all of them with us. Now, it's not just Moses being clever or obstinate even. God has to tell us how we're going to worship. We don't tell God how we're going to worship. This is an important lesson for us today in the church in the 21st century. We don't tell God how we're going to worship. God tells us how we're supposed to worship. And so this is what's going on with Moses here. Moses is saying, no, we really can't just take one cow, one sheep, because we don't know what God's going to want until we get there. And Pharaoh says, of course, no, you can't do that. So you have to stay here. And by the way, Moses and Aaron, don't come here again. For the time you come here again, you're going to die. So, takes us to chapter 11, the warning of the final plague. Moses expects the opportunity to worship. God promises not only will they get a chance to worship, but Pharaoh's going to expel them for good from Egypt. And the way it's going to happen is the firstborn of Pharaoh, the firstborn of every family, the firstborn of the cattle are going to die. But the Israelites will be spared. And so God tells us in chapter 11 how he's going to effect where Pharaoh will finally once and for all say, I can't compete with your God, and I have to let you do what you want to do. So this is putting the lamb's blood on the doorpost and the lintel. This is them eating the Passover meal, the sacrificed lamb. And this is the people dying, the firstborn dying because of the plague. Chapter 12. This happens in the month of Nisan. Interesting little story. I was ministering in a hospital in Chicago when I was a seminarian, and I walked into a room, and there was a woman in the hospital bed who was Jewish, and her husband was sitting in the corner of the chair next to her with his hat on, because the Jewish men, Orthodox, always have their heads covered. And I introduced myself to the patient, the lady. I can't remember what her first name was. And then I introduced myself to the man. He said, "My name is Nisan." And I said, "Oh, like the month." And he looked at me and says, "How did you know that? Most people say like the car." But because I studied Torah, I knew Nisan is the first month of feasts. So it's the most important month. This is the month when Passover has to take place. The memorial of the Passover meal is supposed to be followed by 6 days of eating unleavened bread. So it's called the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And then there's so much in this passage about how they're supposed to eat the meal and what happens to the lamb that points us forward to Christ. For those of you who go to church on Holy Thursday, every year, the first reading on Holy Thursday is this passage from Exodus chapter 12. Remember how we said the sacrifice of Isaac is read every year at the Easter Vigil? It's the third reading of the 7 Old Testament readings. This is read every year on Holy Thursday as the first reading because it so points forward to Jesus. Eating the sacrifice points to the Eucharist. The blood on the doorpost reminds us of the blood of Christ shed for us. Being killed in the evening, the lambs are supposed to be slaughtered in the evening twilight, just before the sun has completely gone down. When was Jesus crucified? Right before the sun was going down. So there's so many things you can see parallels in this Passover that point forward to the true Paschal sacrifice. Speaking of Paschal sacrifice, the word Passover in Hebrew is Pesach. It's one of those words. That's in Hebrew. It gets translated into Greek as Pascha, which you also see in French and Italian, all the Romance languages, and Latin. We still use it. We talk about the Paschal Triduum. We talk about the Paschal candle. What we're really saying, that's our Passover candle. That's our Passover sacrifice. That's our Passover 3 days. So whenever you hear that word Paschal, it's referring to the Passover. It's from the Greek, which comes from the Hebrew, which means the Passover. So it's our Passover. It's not the Passover of Moses. There's a specific ritual. It gets very detailed. As you read through this, you have to eat at this, you have to kill it at this time, you have to have this many people. If you don't have this many people, you have to share it. There's very, very structured ritual. And most of it is for one reason. Do you think God really cares if it's a lamb or a goat or a cow or a pig? Will you be obedient? Because I said so. Because I'm God, and I'm going to do this for you. The one thing I want from you in return is obedience to my will. Will you be my people? Because I'm ready to be your God. And so most of it is just to say, are you going to follow me? Are you going to be obedient to me? Eat it like travelers, because after all, they are. They're getting ready to go on a big journey. The death of the firstborn happens, and Pharaoh says, go. Interesting. Did you notice in that text? Go, take your sheep, your blah, 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 and bless me. Did you see that in there? Go and bless me. Is Pharaoh having a conversion of heart? We're going to see in the next 2 chapters, he's not having a conversion of heart. He's being stubborn. Maybe he's flirting with the idea at best, but there's certainly no conversion. And the meal, notice it says, include your household and your slaves, but no travelers. Because and the slaves that you want to include need to be circumcised. We're going back to your question about circumcision. That's chapter 12. Passover prefigures Christ's sacrifice, death before God leading Israel from Egypt. Chapters 14 and 15. Chapter 13, Remember to, it repeats, remember to keep this every year. Consecrate the first male to open the womb. We're told that God is leading the people by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Does it sound like a God who's with his people? Yes, even in tangible ways. Notice whose bones they take? Joseph. Remember the promise? He made him promise that when they go back to their land to take his bones with them, so they're bringing Joseph's bones. And there's this thing about the Red Sea. So nobody knows what the Red Sea is. Nobody knows. It could be the Gulf of Aqaba. It could be the Gulf of Suez. So if on your map, it's the Gulf of Suez. So if you see where they're crossing the Gulf of Suez. It's actually, the Hebrew doesn't say Red Sea to begin with. The Hebrew says the Reed Sea. R-E-E-D, not R-E-D. So apparently it's named a reed sea because a bunch of reeds. So there's even thoughts that it could be some lakes that existed in those days along the Gulf of Suez in that area there that don't even exist anymore as lakes. And lakes could have had a lot of reeds around them. So we don't really know, but it's just an interesting thing. But we'll keep calling it the Red Sea anyways. Chapter 14 is this miraculous crossing. We hear that every year at the Easter Vigil too. So actually the Genesis reading, chapter 22, is the second reading. The Exodus reading is the third reading. So again, pretty important. This whole crossing of the Red Sea. It's so important that the church puts it at the Easter Vigil every year. And in fact, out of the 7 readings, the church says you don't have to do all 7. You can reduce the number for pastoral reasons, even to as low as 3. But even if you only do 1, this one has to be read. Out of all 7, this is the one that must be read every year at the Easter Vigil, no matter where you. So even if you're doing Easter Vigil in a nursing home, you can only do 1 reading because everybody's falling asleep. You have to do this one. That's how important the church considers what happened at the Red Sea. What happens at the Red Sea? Those same people who cried for help now turn on Moses and God. They see Pharaoh's army and his chariots and charioteers coming after them. And they say, why did you make us leave Egypt? You're going to hear that a whole bunch of times again. Why did you make us leave Egypt? We were happy there. It was wonderful. But you made us leave Egypt. So they doubt. Moses this time doesn't doubt. Moses says, trust in God. And the angel that was guiding them, the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, now goes around behind them to protect them from Pharaoh's approaching army, his chariots and charioteers. You know the rest of the story. They passed through on dry land, and then as they got to the other side, the Egyptians are still pursuing, and the waters flow back in over the Egyptians, and they all drown. Okay, you've heard that reading many times. And then the beginning of chapter 15 is where I'm going to cut off. So this is them passing on dry land, by the way, through the waters on the left and on the right. And then we have the Song of Moses. Let us sing to the Lord. He is gloriously triumphant. Horse and chariot he has cast into the sea. And so they sing praises to God on the shore where God effected a miracle. So that's Exodus 1 through 15 in, that was a lot of time, 45 minutes. Somebody said the other day, they said, you can describe all of Exodus in like 15 seconds. People are enslaved, God frees them, they leave, we're done. It's a little less satisfying. So I'll turn you back to your groups now, and you've got some discussion questions on the first 15 chapters. Thanks, Chris.